Welcome to the Bauhaus in Dessau. I'm standing here in front of the Bauhaus building in Dessau, erected in 1926, and I'd like to talk very briefly about the Bauhaus in the making. I'm starting with an episode that is related to a correspondence between Walter Gropius and Joseph Albers in 1938, so to speak, 12 years after this building has been erected. And this correspondence has taken place in the US. It was related to a show that Walter Gropius has planned together with Herbert Bayer, based on an invitation of Alfred Barr, the curator of the Museum of Modern Art. And the idea of the show was to represent the history of the Bauhaus from 1919 to 1928, so exactly the period that Gropius was the director of that school. And Gropius was asking Albers to send him a few artifacts, objects, art pieces from the Bauhaus, from his courses he taught, with this idea to give a rather large retrospective of the history of the school. So Albers was a teacher at the Bauhaus for the preliminary course. He, together with his wife Annie Albers, immigrated already in 1934 to the US. Gropius 3 years later, based on an invitation for a professorship for chairing as a professor at the architecture school in Harvard. So the very idea of this exhibition was explained in the letter, and Albers was responding to Gropius with a certain skepticism regarding this idea of such a retrospective show. And he explained what is going to be the outcome of such a show, and I'm a bit skeptical in regards to this conception, because it is not so important what we have done so far, represented in the very artifacts and objects and artworks, but rather than the way we underwent, together with the students, the process of learning and teaching, the experiments we have done. Without highlighting these aspects of experiments, of trial and error, there might be a certain undertone in the show that opens up a mode of reception that is more related to the object itself and to the artifacts. And so far, there might be a certain outcome that is much more about a retrospective than something that explains the attempts we have undertaken in the experiments. Finally, this show has played a major role. The 1938 exhibition at the MoMA has played a major role in a particular mode of reception of the Bauhaus that has led to a certain canon, one could even explain it as such. And this canon has focused on a more stylistic and formal reception of the Bauhaus that has shaped almost the 20th century. So we are all familiar with the furniture outcome of the Bauhaus, which we often reframe with the phrase Bauhaus style. And so far, Albers was wise, because he, in a way, envisioned already a very reduced and also limited reception of the Bauhaus that has taken place in the 20th century, formed out of various different exhibitions, starting probably with the 1938 show, with the 1968 show. It has continued with a lot of narratives, publications that it has even, in a way, advocated this particular Bauhaus style and taking less into consideration the broad and different and heterogeneous history of that school. I'm standing here in front of that building, which probably has formed one of the canons of this very idea of the Bauhaus style, and standing here in front of the workshop wing that was the core of the building and represents in a way the very frame of the school that was active in that building. So stacked up on each other, three of the workshops were essential for the very idea of a pedagogy that was based on learning by doing. We are in the workshop wing of the Bauhaus building. Gropius called it laboratories for the industry. But this title is related to the very conception of this teaching idea, and it differs very much from the traditional conception of art schools, for example. When you remember how actually in art schools the ateliers of the artists look like, there's often this constellation that students sit in front of a maquette of a Greek or a Rome sculpture, in order to get trained alongside the canonic beauty of a very Western idea of tradition in terms of art education. This you won't find in this kind of constellation. The same applies also to the difference, for example, to the school situation as the university or a polytechnic institution, where you usually have classrooms, and this teaching in front of the classroom is certainly related to a divide between, on the one hand, a practical education, and on the other hand, someone that gives theoretical instructions. Here we have a quite contrast constellation, because it's really about learning by doing. So students were deeply interwoven in the practice of being instructed, but at the same time also experimenting, training, practicing, getting engaged with the material, with the tools, and with the machines. So that made actually the particular instructions at the Bauhaus and the teaching at the Bauhaus very specific in regard to other school models that I was just briefly sketching out. I'm here in the former weaving workshop, filled up with looms, mechanical looms, hand looms, as well as jacquard looms. As you might can imagine, it looked very different to the nowadays situation. And the very idea of that weaving workshop in Dessau was that it was less about following the conception of European tapisseries or gobelins, but rather than what the weavers by themselves has established as a concept, it was to create textiles for utility purposes. So the weaving workshop was conceived as the only class women could join the school, although there were two male students at the weaving workshop attending, but by an in-depth perspective on the weaving workshop, also looking into the growing body of literature in regards to the Bauhaus weaving workshop, and get a more differentiated picture about the constellation of the weaving workshop here in Dessau. When Gunther Stürzer took over the position as a master of form of the weaving workshop, she claimed that they wanted to depart from the very idea of pictures made out of wool. And this thesis, or this assertion, was a kind of a provocation against the traditional idea of textile art and textile design in the space of the decorative and the applied arts. It was always conceived as a kind of less important than, for example, the Fine Arts Academy teaching, and was certainly conceived as the space for feminine crafts. And Gunther Stürzer wanted to depart from that. And her second agenda was, so we do not want to create pictures made of wool, but rather than we want to design fabrics in space. So this shift from the tradition of European tapestry and gobelins towards textile that could be used for everyday life, this was a very radical move. Certainly related to the very idea of the laboratories of the industry, so the very idea of the workshops itself, but entailed a much broader cosmology also of engagement with various different cultures of making. So when you look into the documents and the notes of the weavers, you might detect that there is a constant engagement with various different forms of making. So struggling for being engaged with the handloom meant also learning and following the event of the thread, as Annie Albers once explained, one of the students of the weaving workshop. So, and that meant learning while doing. That meant following this logic of the practicing of the weaving, and that explained also a bit the insistence of a kind of a transition zone between on one hand maintenance of the practice of craft, and at the same time also using this knowledge and using this expertise for a new profession that could be really engaged with the growing role of designers in the textile industry. So insofar, the very idea of the laboratory of the industries was articulated in the weaver's space in a very explicit way as a transit zone between, on the one hand, a kind of a crafty workshop, but at the same time considering that as moving into actually a factory mode. So being someone that can overlook the production of the factory and being able also to conduct as a designer the whole process of the development of a prototype. So this kind of in-between zone shaped very much actually the agenda not only of the weaving workshop, but generally the agenda of the workshops at the Bauhaus itself. Instead of considering the weaving space as a refuge of the feminine craft, we would rather put emphasis on the weaving workshop as a space of emancipation. And what that means is that the weavers were searching for an alternative practice that oscillates between actually a new understanding of craft and at the same time reinventing their own practice as weavers that might be also fitting into the new constellations of a textile designer for the industry. Some of the outcomes that are produced in the weaving workshop are presented in the Bauhaus Museum. And you might detect here already, this is a particular language that has focused mainly on the design that was given already by the particular looms they were used in the weaving workshop. So they focus on the stripes, they focus on a particular pattern of colors. Beside this interest in sort of the language of the new machinery that was applied, there's also a strong dialogue between actually what the weavers have developed in the Bauhaus Dessau weaving workshop and they're being rooted in a very old tradition of crafting. That was what Annie Albers has often emphasized in her writings about weaving. In her text on weaving, she has published later in the time period she was teaching at Yale, she described the weaving workshop as based and rooted in a very ancient tradition. And what she meant with that was not only a kind of a romantic retrospective on the tradition of the weavers, but rather than putting emphasis on a search for alternative routes of their cultural practice that was related to a different understanding of textile culture. Annie Albers and some other colleagues of the weaving workshop visited quite often in the 1920s the ethnographic collections of pre-Columbian textiles in Berlin. It was part even of the curriculum that Gunda Stölzel has invented to visit those collections that were widely presented in Berlin. And despite its very problematic and colonial background of these objects, for the weavers it was a lesson in understanding their practice differently. So it's a kind of an ambiguous encounter between, so to speak, these remnants of textiles they discovered in Berlin and the way how they interpreted it into their own understanding of textile culture. And this was related to an understanding where looking at those ancient pieces of textile as very important tools that in a way knitted the community together. This was one of the functions actually of those kind of textiles they adored by looking into the ethnographic collections in Berlin. They sought this kind of understanding of textiles as communication tools for a community that could be a very important and valuable source for their own thinking and new interpretation of textiles. So insofar, this very reduced abstract patterns they discovered there, and they stand in very contrast to the very European tradition of gobelins. So this gave them a kind of a hint and inspiration for a new thinking of their own abstract design of textiles. But we do not only present, for example, these beautiful textiles you might see here from the weaving workshop, but our interest in that museum is also to show the process of learning. So not only the outcomes, as Joseph Albers was skeptical in regard to the show of 1938, and I started with, but rather than showing the way how they came to those kind of designs. And so we introduced here in our exhibition the drawers. And these drawers gives you an idea about the learning in the weaving workshop. So our visitors get acquainted much more only also with the process, how they came to those ideas of producing such a textile. So you might see here some of the notes of the weavers in Dessau, the way how they studied intensively different fabrics and structures of binding, and from that developed their own ideas of design. The Bauhaus in the making I promise this is going to be the title of this short talk. How to exhibit such an approach that Joseph Albers, in the short episode I started with, claimed to be probably the most successful way to talk and to present the Bauhaus. We are here in the new museum, and in one part that is focusing on particular aspects of experiments and tests that Bauhaus undertook. And we are asking in this particular gallery questions the Bauhaus was asking by themselves, questions that were related to the way how they were approaching this new time they were facing. A time that was shaped by industrial production, mass consumerism, a time that was shaped by the experience of the First World War, a time that was also shaped by the first advent of globalization, so a deep interwovenness of different parts of the world due to colonialism, to trade, but also due to change in the economy that was deeply integrated. And also, certainly, confronted with new means of communication, certainly not comparable with our nowadays conditions, but for those times, radio, telephone, telegraphy offered already new means to connect and to combine the world. And in this respect, some of the questions the Bauhaus was asking themselves might have a certain topicality even for today. And here we are in front of one of these little cabinets that addressing questions like, how can design become tactile? Tactility was one of the most important aspects in the preliminary course. It was about training the senses of the students to an extent that goes beyond the visual. The visual is conceived as one of the senses central trainings that reach its heydays in the modern era. So photography, film, new means of communication offered also new means of visual perception. So it became the dominant mean of orientation within the new realities. And regard to that, what the most of the Bauhaus teachers recognized and acknowledged was that students lost other capacities of sensual engagement with the world. So specifically for Laszlo Moholy-Nagy in his training about the senses within the preliminary course, it was a lot about excavating actually this historical sensual sort of capacities of the human beings, meaning the haptics and the tactile sense. And this was certainly not only important for the majority of the students, but certainly also very much related to the weaving workshop itself. And here again, this tactile sense, this training of the tactile sense was not simply a pedagogic endeavor. It was about expanding actually the sensual sort of perception of the students, but it had a much broader scope in regards to the societal conditions and the cultural conditions under which Moholy-Nagy developed such a program. It was about the experience that most of the objects already produced en masse in an industrial society were fairly disconnected from the users. So people were connected with materials and with objects that were very alienated to them. So they didn't know where the resources came from. They didn't know where these objects were produced. As I said already in the beginning, they were deeply interwoven with already a kind of a globalized trade and economy. And in this regard, this kind of alienation towards the material culture, the becoming abstractness of the world of objects people were confronted with, this sounds very familiar to our contemporary conditions. And so far the question, how design become again tactile, is also a message that reaches to our very contemporary times, in which we are confronted with a material world that is similar, abstract, that is similar, disconnected to the way how we operate in our everyday life with materials and things. So this new thinking of a material culture sits in the very core of the Bauhaus, and it is an agenda that is specifically nowadays for designers, for artists, but also for architects, a very essential question, taking into account the conditions of the Anthropocene, in which almost everything is man-made and in which we are confronted with the climate change and resource shortage. So what we see here, this kind of little cabinet curation, tells us various ways how actually this question of approaching tactility, learning from materials, gives us also some ideas how we nowadays could deal with this cosmology of materials that are so essential for the designers of a nowadays world.